I'm going to show you how to look up content through the Orchestrator REST API. Let's get started.
Hi everyone, I'm Brian Watrous from VVork. If this is your first time here and you want to learn about automating, programming, and monitoring in VMware environments, you're in the right place.
In the intro, I said that we were going to learn how to look up content. But what is content? I don't know. Well, actually, we're going to find out here in a moment. And not only are we going to find out what content is, we're going to find out how to look it up and how it's useful. So let's head off to the lab environment. As you can see, I'm already logged into Postman. Additionally, I've already gone through a few steps. Specifically, I've loaded up the variable, the Postman variable called workflow_name with hello world. I then ran get workflow ID by workflow name so that I could know the ID of that workflow. And now if I wanted to, I could do things like run the workflow. We've already seen how to do all those steps in previous videos. But in this video, what we're going to do is run a REST request that looks at that workflow ID and gets the content of that specific workflow. So what we're just about to do here is get the content of the hello world workflow. But again, what do we mean by content? Well, I think the easiest way to understand what we mean by content is to go look at some. So let's click send, check our response code. We got back a 200. Again, we could look here, but I'm going to copy the response body and take it over to Postman like I've done so many times before. I'm going to paste it in. I'll type Control-Alt-Shift-P and Control-Alt-Shift-J to load up the tree browser here. And again, let's start taking a look at what content is. So if we just start expanding, as you can see, we've got a bunch of different properties here, starting with allowed operations. Allowed operations allows us to see the permissions on the workflow. Can we view it? Can we execute it? API version says which version of the API we're using. Next up is attributes. This particular workflow does not have any attributes. Remember, attributes is the old name for what we now call variables. So there's no variables to this particular workflow. If there were, they would show up here. Speaking of similar things, this section here is where we could see any inputs to this workflow, if we had any. This workflow doesn't have inputs, nor does it have any outputs. So there's a section for the variables, a section for the inputs, and a section for the outputs. We can see the name of the workflow is hello world, no surprise there. And we can see a description of the workflow. What else do we have here? Well, right here, we have the workflow ID. You'll recognize this one ends in 22Charlie2. That's the workflow ID for hello world. Object-name lets us know, in case we've forgotten what we're looking at, it lets us know that what this is we're looking at is a workflow. You can get content information for other types of objects in Orchestrator. So while it may seem a little bit odd at first to see it's telling you this is a workflow, I know it's a workflow. I just told you to give me the content for this workflow. That's why it says this here. Position gives XY coordinates for where the workflow schema should show up in the canvas. What else do we have? Restart mode and resume from failed mode has to do with a setting that perhaps you've seen before. Let's go find hello world. Here's hello world. Again, let's make certain that this is the right workflow. That's workflow ID 22Charlie2. The two properties that we just saw in Postman in the response body, actually, let's just flip over there real quick again to make really clear what we're talking about. These two settings are what the response body is talking about when it says restart mode and resume from failed mode. So what are those? What those are, let's start with this one. Orchestrator has a really useful feature that it uses known as checkpointing. The basic idea behind checkpointing is that as a workflow goes from one schema element to another schema element to another schema element, each time we get to a new schema element, Orchestrator saves the entire state of the workflow. It saves all the variables, the inputs, the outputs, and information about where we are in the workflow. The reason why Orchestrator uses that checkpointing feature is so that in the unlikely event the Orchestrator server crashes, again, that's unlikely. Perhaps more likely, in the event that somebody stops the Orchestrator server, either of those two events would cause any running workflows to be interrupted. Now, we could have designed Orchestrator to respond to that by restarting the workflows when the Orchestrator server comes back up, but we do something better. Because we have all that state information that we get by checkpointing each schema element, that enables us to behave even more intelligently when the Orchestrator server comes back up. When the Orchestrator server comes back up, workflows that have this checkpointing feature turned on will resume where they left off. They'll start up again on the schema element that they were on. Again, notice I said resume, not a complete restart, but resume from where the workflow left off. Again, I think that's a pretty cool feature. If for whatever reason you don't want that feature turned on, you can choose do not resume workflow. These don't say this, but the value of this entry here is 0. The value of this one is 1. That's why when we go look at our response body, it says 1. Again, 1 here means that we do want the checkpointing feature turned on. 0 means we want it turned off. Then there's another setting here. Let's go see where it shows up in the user interface. That's this one here. This feature sounds similar, and it's kind of similar, but it's different. The point of this setting is to enable you to say what to do if the workflow fails. Now, normally, when a workflow fails, the workflow just crashes. And it's up to you to go look at its workflow token and figure out what went wrong. But Orchestrator has several choices that it gives you here. If you choose to enable this feature and your workflow crashes, instead of just crashing the workflow, we pause the workflow. Now, the idea behind pausing the workflow is that oftentimes the problems that cause our workflows to crash are things that have nothing to do with the workflow, but instead have to do with issues in your infrastructure. For example, if we have a workflow that's doing things like deploying virtual machines into vSphere, but the data store we're trying to deploy into is full, that's not a problem with the workflow. That's a problem with your storage array. So if we've chosen to enable this feature, when the workflow runs, it attempts to create the machine and discovers we don't have enough disk space, what will happen is the orchestrator will pause this workflow. It will make you aware that it's paused, and then you have the opportunity to go into your infrastructure, correct the problem, perhaps add more disk space, and once you've corrected the infrastructure issue, you can resume the workflow. And it will be as if the workflow never ran into that problem at all. Again, that's a feature that you can turn on or off, or you can use the system default. I seem to recall the system default is this feature turned off, but you can turn it on, obviously, with this choice. Alternatively, you can, I know for certain that disabled means turn it off. All right, let's go back to our response body. In the response body, what else do we have? So we learned about these two. Root-name is the name of the first schema element that is in your workflow. To be more accurate, if we look at our workflow, yes, there's a start schema element, but the first schema element that has what's known as an item number, this is the root of our workflow, and if we look at it, you'll notice that it says item 1, just like it says in our response body. This is version 0.0.0 of this workflow, and we also have this property called workflow item, which is an array of potentially lots of interesting things. Let's go ahead and expand workflow item and see what we have. Well, in this case, it says that workflow item, the array, has 2 elements to it. Those correspond to this schema element and that schema element. Again, yes, there's a start schema element, but we're API programmers. We just ignored the start schema element. So if I want to find out information about this schema element, I can go into the response body and look at element 0. Again, these are not item numbers, but rather I think these are not item numbers. If I recall correctly, these are not item numbers. These are the sequence as we follow through the workflow. Double check me on that. But let's take a look at one. So if we look at element 0, we have different pieces of information that are potentially quite useful and interesting. For example, type task means that the thing that we're looking at is a scriptable task. Again, if we go back to the workflow, that's a scriptable task. If we continue looking here, what else do we see? Scriptable tasks have code in them in the scripting tab. So if we look here, here is the code that schema element runs. Again, we can double check that by going to Orchestrator Client, looking at the scripting tab, and sure enough, there's the code. Going back to the response body, what else do we have? We have position, once again, XY coordinates that are indicating where this schema element is positioned. So I'm drastically changing the XY position here. If I were to save this workflow and then go run that REST request again, we would see that the XY coordinates are very different than they are or were when we ran this REST request. What else do we have? We have a description of the schema element. We have the label for the schema element. If there are any inward bindings or outward bindings, we have them accessible. Again, those are not the inputs and outputs of the workflow per se. Those are the inward bindings and outward bindings, of which there are none in this workflow, but they're the inward bindings and outward bindings for the workflow that we're interrogating. And what else do we have here? If I missed anything, so he said out name. I think that's everything. Except I don't believe I mentioned that Orchestrator has apparently the capability to encrypt your source code. The reason why we do that is one of the permissions that you can set when you set the permissions on a workflow or you export the workflow in a package is we can encrypt the contents of various things, such as the scripting code of the scriptable task, so that whoever you send this workflow to won't be able to see how it's implemented. And as you can see, that's a lot of additional information that you can delve into. We call that information collectively content. But if you look at the API documentation, you'll discover REST requests that we allow you to run to look up content for other types of Orchestrator objects. Join me in the next video as we continue to explore the Orchestrator REST API.